So, gentlemen, this is where we left off last time. We did some translation last time. We discussed a worksheet last time. We didn't get much beyond this. When we talk about beyond the flood to Babel, we look at a continuing history of sin. That's the thing that really is striking about chapter 9, verse 20 through to chapter 11, verse 9. Those who went on the ark were sinners. So they brought their sin with them. So although God had judged sinners and slain all of the earth except the 8 on the ark, the new world, so to speak, instead of beginning like with Adam and Eve, is beginning with fallen mankind. That is the key thing to remember and look at here. Remember, it's almost parallel to when we look at the Great Tribulation. The Great Tribulation is a time of judgment in the future, 7 years of judgment. And then after that, the Lord Jesus Christ returns to earth and he sets up his kingdom, his millennial kingdom for 1,000 years. But who enters the kingdom? It's not just those who have been resurrected. It's not just the members of the church who will reign with Christ. We have living people entering the millennium as fallen human beings. And so in the kingdom, we have exactly the same type of situation, except that we have a perfect king, a perfect ruler, a perfect government, and a perfect system of worship that is being carried out for those 1,000 years. But toward the end of those 1,000 years, we see a rebellion. A rebellion takes place. Why? Because many of those who have entered the kingdom are unbelievers. They're sinners. They're fallen individuals. And so what it does is it closes out the program of redemption by demonstrating that even if we have a perfect government, a perfect earth, a perfect environment, and a perfect ruler, that still fallen man will rebel against God. And those perfections, that utopia is insufficient. How often have you heard people say, oh, I believe in God and I trust what is happening here if God demonstrates himself to be good and we could live in the midst of a society that is perfect, that is God-controlled and manifesting the characteristics of God, oh, then I believe in him. But how can I believe in a God that you say is good and gracious and merciful when I live in a world that is such a mess, right? I know sometimes when I witness to people, that's the reaction I get. They say, how can there be a God like you describe when we have a world like what we live in? They think that if it were perfect, then they'd believe. But what God is going to prove is even when it's perfect, they won't believe. Instead, they will rebel. They will rebel against his Messiah, and they will engage in war against him at the close of the millennial kingdom. So it'll be the final declaration that the fallen individual can absolutely do nothing for their own salvation. They cannot please God and indeed are enemies of God through and through. And our sinfulness and our blindness in sin and unbelief is such that even with perfection, it's not believed. It's not believed. So it's a continuing history of sin. Yes, Roberto.
Just in that same mindset, if Noah's flood shows us that sin cannot be mitigated by the effects of the flood, right? Then how does that necessarily affect our understanding of the rise of Abraham in chapter 12? What is God doing there? Is he now saying I can't wipe out sin through judgment, so now I need to redeem humanity? Is that what he's doing there?
I think he's teaching us a lesson that involved that. It's not him saying he cannot do it. It's saying that it's teaching us that only God can provide his redemptive program, that man can't do it themselves, that man, fallen man, given a brand new start, with all flagrant sinners removed, still will not be able to establish the kingdom of God and will not be able to live in a fashion pleasing to God in every way. And so these are lessons to teach us so that we learn to depend upon God and God alone. It's not God admitting that he can't do something. It's God trying to teach us that we can't do something. And next week when we wrap up, as we get to the end of chapter 11, I'm going to move into that transition to Abraham and answer that very excellent question you asked, is what is the purpose of Abraham in the light of this? What's the purpose of Genesis chapters 1 through 11 in view of Abraham? And I'll cover that next week as we wrap it up, okay? So when we look at Noah's drunkenness and Ham sin, first of all, Ham sin is not homosexuality. It's not homosexuality. Those who claim that it's homosexuality are trying to read into the text something that is not there. If you read the text with care, it doesn't amount to homosexuality. There's no act committed by Ham here that in some way is sexually related to his father. That's not what is involved, and we'll take a look at that here a little bit more. Mark Smith has written a book on some of the poetic passages of the Old Testament and comparing them with Gilgamesh epic and with the tale of Enkidu and with Homer's Odyssey and Iliad, etc. And in so doing, he also deals with this question of whether or not this is homosexuality. And I was surprised to see him work through that and come to the conclusion that no, it is not. And he points out the fact that there's a lack of direct statement, there's a lack of even implication here, and that when you read through the text as a whole and reach the end of it, we find out what's involved. And so as we look at that, what it is a disrespect for his father. Ham ridiculed his father's drunken and naked state. Instead of covering his father and showing respect, he goes out and talks about it to his brothers. He says, oh, did you see Dad in there? He did nothing to show respect or regard for his father. He did everything to show disrespect and disregard for his father. And that is why when the punishment comes upon Ham, it doesn't fall upon Ham himself, it falls upon his son. Because his son is going to turn out to disrespect his father Ham by not following his father's faith. And that is the real message here. It is disrespect. It is not honoring his father as he ought. It's breaking one of the 10 commandments of honoring father and mother. And it is also putting a focus upon that aspect of what God expects of believers, even in the time of the patriarchs. Canaan's curse and the blessing of Ham and Japheth in chapter 9, verses 24 to 27. Again here, notice the curse is not directly on Ham, it's put on Canaan. And it's because that son relationship to the father is what's the important aspect. You see, if it was homosexuality, it wouldn't matter what the relationship was whatsoever, because homosexuality is declared to be a sin throughout the Scriptures. It is contrary to the pattern and creative pattern of God. And so the fact that the sonship relationship is what is emphasized here demonstrates that the focus is on something that is other than homosexuality. It's not homosexuality. And it's not a matter of having black skin or either as a result of the curse. There have been those throughout history who have tried to say that Ham was cursed and therefore his skin was turned black, and therefore the black-skinned peoples of the world are the result of Ham's sin. There's nothing of that nature here in the text whatsoever. There's nothing about ethnic diversity or genetic diversity here. And Canaan, as well as Ham, were probably olive-skinned. Black skin here is not any part of this curse or of this event. Craig?
Yeah, I have heard the theory that there are three sub-races within humanity, the Mongoloid race, the Caucasoid race, and the Negroid race. Has that been discredited? Is that even still held?
It's actually we have more than three major races in humanity. And they seem to have all developed out of the three sons of Noah and their descendants. And with some of them, like with Ham, it appears that more than one type of race has developed or has come out of it. And this is something we find throughout all of them. The diversity is not tied to just one line or another. And as we go through chapter 10 and especially chapter 11 next week, one of the questions we're going to answer is one that's asked by this book by Bill Cooper called After the Flood. And what he did is he took Japheth as just one example. And he said, okay, the text seems to say that all peoples are descendants of the three sons of Noah. All peoples, worldwide, not just in the ancient Near East. The current theory by most Old Testament scholars is that Genesis 10 to 11 is dealing only with ancient Near Eastern peoples, not with all the peoples of the world. However, Cooper points out very clearly, by going back through the history and genealogies of European nations, that the European nations actually traced their variety of lines back to Japheth. And it is a fascinating read and a fascinating study. Now, what someone needs to do is do the same type of work with regard to Ham and with regard to Shem. And one of the things that comes out of it is that both Shem and Ham have a relationship to part of Arabia and Ethiopia known as Cush, where we have two different developing groups of Cushites. And one seems to be a descendant of Ham, the other one seems to be a descendant of Shem. And that brings out some very interesting aspects. Then you have always the question, okay, when we're talking about the Mongoloid type, we're talking about Chinese, we're talking about Japanese, the various Oriental types in the human race, where do they come into this entire story? I'm going to answer that next week and deal with it. I'm kind of disappointed in a way that more haven't done study along that line to answer the question, where are the Chinese here? The Chinese represent one of the oldest civilizations on the planet. And that ancient civilization has many ties to the biblical story of the flood and to other areas of the Old Testament, both in theology and in history and in sociology, that is often ignored. And very few people understand what all could be brought out and studied there. And I think it's an area that someone needs to do a book just like this and answer that question and say, okay, let's go through this. Robert Dick Wilson, years ago at Princeton University, published a series of papers on the genealogies and on the lists of peoples and nations in chapters 10 and 11. I would highly recommend that to you for reading. Some of the study that he pursued has never been responded to. No one has picked it up, tried to critique it, criticize it, modify it, revise it, improve it, or discredit it, because he was such an overwhelmingly respected and dominating scholar. He worked with a wealth of wisdom and knowledge that was unmatched in his day. But it's obvious that he didn't know everything. No one knows everything. And so much has been discovered and has been dug out of the ground, has been translated and interpreted since his day in the 1920s, that it certainly needs updating and certainly needs some critique and some revision, if not correction, and addition. And someone needs to do that. It's amazing to me that we've gone now almost 100 years and no one has picked that up and said, I'm going to work on this. It's worthy, fellows, of someone doing a dissertation and evaluating Robert Dick Wilson. Yes? Robert Dick Wilson. And it's published in the Princeton, I think it's the Princeton Review was what it was published in. It was one of the Princeton journals in the either somewhere between 1915 and 1925, I believe, that he did the publishing. I think it was actually a series of 2 or 3 different articles. And it is really tremendous material. And really, we know so much more now than they knew then, than even Robert Dick Wilson knew. He was fluent in 45 different languages, modern and ancient. And his works are rarely challenged because of the depth of the scholarship and the fact that anyone who's ever tried to contradict him just ends up with not a leg to stand on. So they end up giving up before they go further. But it's long overdue for checking it. So anyway, as we're talking about this in chapter 9, we're talking about the sin of Ham. There have been a lot of misunderstanding here. Racism in the United States, racism in South Africa, racism in England and throughout Europe was often based upon a misinterpretation of Genesis 9. And we read it through. There's nothing there that can support that viewpoint, a racist viewpoint, and talking about a curse coming on black skin as a result of what's here. When you look at the descendants of Canaan, the son of Ham, they're olive-skinned as well as dark-skinned. You have members of that same family that have the variations, and the variations appear to be with where they lived and with the pigment of the skin being affected by the melanin in it and by the tropical sun and location. And it's something that transpired over time, that they adapted to the environments in which they were living, and it was just part of the way that God arranged that to happen. We see the same thing with the line of Shem. The line of Shem includes dark skin, olive skin, and light skin. And when you start talking about the Chinese, we've also got to talk about the American Indian, the red skin, and the features of the American Indian, the Native Americans, who are Asiatic in nature. And so as we're looking at all those, we have all the variety of peoples coming out of these 3. But there are varieties even coming out of individual sons in the families. It's not that you have only 3. Some say that there are 6 different types of Homo sapiens, and that the 6 different types then would come out of 3 sons, 3 lines. Yes?
It's really interesting. In Incan history mythology, they say that the world started when 7 brothers came out of a flood, and then they populated the earth. And there's this weird things how women came about, but that idea that everything started out of a flood and how only 7 people survived.
That's right. And again, 7 is very close to the number of the variety of the human race. And of course, 7 is a kind of a magical number, symbolic number of perfection or completion. Notice the flood there. We have the flood legend known throughout the world. Native American tribes, the nation of India, the peoples in India, China, Japan, Europe, Africa. We have flood legends all over the world. And there's a grain of truth in all of them, a grain of truth in all of them. And then, we as fallen human beings, what do? We skew the historical account and the reality and add to it over time to where you can hardly recognize it at times. But it's there, and it occurred. The blessing on Shem is inseparable from this account that brings the curse upon Ham and his descendants. Notice here, Shem, and this is getting close to what Roberto was asking about with regard to Abraham. Abraham is a descendant of Shem. All right? Chapter 12 of Genesis deals with the blessings that come through Abraham, and we're talking about the blessing on Shem here. Abraham is going to embody that and fulfill it and expand upon that. But in Genesis chapter 15, what is Abraham told? His descendants are going to occupy what people or destroy what people? The Canaanites. The Canaanites. You see, the blessing on Shem is going to be involved in the curse upon Canaan. And the curse upon Canaan is that which is part and parcel then of God's program of redemption and how he's going to bring about everything. This time I spent in Israel impressed upon me again the significance of, quote unquote, the Holy Land. Many people ask me, well, you know, why do we use the term Holy Land? We look at it as being mystical. We look at it as being illogical, non-theological. We think of it as being non-evangelical, unchristian, to refer to the land of Israel as the Holy Land. But the scriptures speak of it that way. Psalm 78, verse 54, calls it the Holy Land. Zechariah chapter 2, verse 12, calls it the Holy Land. Jerusalem is called the Holy City. Jerusalem is named 809 times in the Bible, 141 times in the New Testament. The New Testament begins in Matthew chapter 4, verse 5, referring to Jerusalem as the Holy City. The Gospel of Matthew closes in chapter 27, verse 53, referring to Jerusalem as the Holy City. But the New Testament also closes with a reference to Jerusalem as the Holy City in Revelation chapter 11. The city identified specifically as where Jesus was pierced, was slain. And the book of Revelation closes with a vision of a new Jerusalem. Not a new LA, not a new London, not a new New York, not a new Tokyo, not a new Cape Town, not a new Paris, a new Jerusalem. The heavenly Jerusalem that comes down from God and is the precursor of the heavenly environment, the new heavens and new earth, bears that title. So we have to remember that the land is holy. Ezekiel chapter 36, God says, he tells the land that it is his land. And it's his land whether or not his people are residing on it. In fact, because it is his land, his people are removed from it because of their sinfulness and their failure to regard it as his land. Ezekiel chapter 36, talking about the new birth, talking about the ministry of the Spirit, has a full section there dealing with the land and talking about it specifically, in fact, addressing the land. Joel chapter 1, verse 5, Joel chapter 3 talks about Israel being the land of Yahweh. My land, he calls it, refers to it as. And we have to realize that God chose that land. He didn't choose the Golden State of California. He didn't choose South Africa. He didn't choose Egypt. He didn't choose Iraq. He didn't choose China. He didn't choose France. He chose the land of Israel. He chose that land, that location. Because of his choice, it is therefore holy. It is set apart to his purpose. That is the stage, the location upon which he chose and still chooses and will choose to complete his program of kingdom and redemption. And so it's going to be involved in the future, as you see it in Revelation chapter 11. It'll be in the streets of Jerusalem that the two witnesses are slain for the witness of the gospel, and their bodies lie in the street for 3 days while the whole earth watches. God's not through with that land yet. It is still where he chose to do things. He chose a real location in real time with real people to fulfill his program of redemption. He chose to send Jesus, or he chose to send his Son, the Son of God, to Israel, to become an Israelite, to be born an Israelite, in order to fulfill the program of redemption. Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem. He's going to return to the Mount of Olives. Zechariah 14, verses 1 through 5. He's returning there. We cannot escape that. We should not avoid calling it the Holy Land. That is a biblical terminology that has biblical theology behind it, and we ought to recognize that. And the reality of it is God chose that place to be that. Now, does that mean we gain some holiness by going on pilgrimage there? Absolutely not. Does going to the Holy Land save us from our sins? Absolutely not. But if we don't recognize that it has a special place in God's program, we are being disobedient and we're being blind to biblical truth. Daniel?
Could you comment then too on how, like in the Gospels, it seems like Jerusalem is also characterized as an evil place that, like, oh, they've rejected God, that all the prophets have to die in Jerusalem, I think Luke 13.
That's right. Well, remember, Jerusalem there is not spoken of as the place, it's spoken of as the people who inhabit it. And we see the same thing in Revelation chapter 11. It's called Sodom. It's called Sodom. In the same chapter, it refers to it as the holy city. It's called Sodom. It's because of the people and because of the disobedience there. But it's still the place God chose. And it's still the place where God is going to fulfill his program, regardless of his people. Regardless of what's going on in Israel today, God's going to fulfill his program. The people of Israel could be removed from his land again in our own time before the return of the Messiah, because it's his land regardless. And what defiles the land is the sin of the people on the land and in the city. So yes, there's that dual reference. And it's the reality of fallen nature of man and the effects upon this world. But it does not change that it's his land. It belongs to him because he chose it. The same as we are holy because he chose us. Not because of any good within us, obviously not. The same as he chose Israel, not because they're the greatest of all nations, not because they're the most spiritual of all nations. He chose them of his own free will and sovereign choice to fulfill his program of kingdom and redemption. And thereby they are holy, a holy people. We speak of them as a holy people generically, but it's obvious that only the remnant is truly holy. But why are they holy? Because they are chosen by him to be the conduit for the Messiah, and chosen by him to be the conduit through which he will accomplish his future program still upon the earth. So we really need to keep that in focus. I think too often we neglect that, or we downplay it, or we ignore it, or we try to, as some. I mean, when you visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, it's enough to make you sick of those Christian groups that are so focused on the so-called holiness of these sites that they're ignoring the overall message of God in it. And so we don't want to go to that extreme, but we want to wedge it very carefully. Okay, so we've already gotten partly into Roberto's question there about Abraham and relationship by what we see here, because it's tied directly back to chapter 9, the last verses there, and what we see developing. And then we see it really brought out in Genesis 15. So we have Noah's death then described and his sons listed without regard to their birth order. That is of interest. And the mention of flood then highlights the significance of the flood still to the way that the history is being recounted. And then we start this record of nations descending from Noah's sons. Chapter 10 and verse 1. And these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And there was born to them children after the flood. There were children born to them after the flood. That's our introduction. And we're told that they bore children, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Noah bore no more children. Shem, Ham, and Japheth did. And we begin with that. We have the tide of the flood. It has that same significance that we see when we get to the end of chapter 5. And we're talking there about the line of Adam and how it comes down to Noah and Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And now we're back to it, but now we're looking at how it's going through now the coming years and the future that follows the flood. So first of all, we're given the sons of Japheth in verses 2 through 5. And you'd think, well, wait a minute. Why not start with Shem, the line of blessing from chapter 9? But it doesn't start there. It starts with Japheth. And then it moves to Ham in verses 6 through 20. And it's in that section we also get involved in the line that talks about Nimrod and talks about Babel. These figures that stand out loud and clear here and help remind us that this is a history of a huge part of the ancient Near East. We're talking about Iraq and Iran in that region when we're talking about this. And finally, we get to Shem in verses 21 to 31. Now, note two things. Shem is placed last for emphasis and also for the continuity of the following story. The one who is last mentioned is the one who is going to be dealt with and worked on. Notice we saw that way back in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Bereshith bara Elohim, eth hashamayim ve'eth ha'aretz. Verse 2, ve'ha'aretz hayathat tohu wavohu. The earth is the focus. That which is mentioned last becomes the focus. It's not about the heavens, it's about the earth. And all the way through Genesis, the writer, Moses, tends to do this. He puts things in an order where as we go through, that which is last mentioned in a section is that which begins the next section and becomes the focal point. So Shem is the focal point. We have the clue in chapter 9 at the end when we have the blessing on him. Now we have that confirmed by the fact that his line is left to last. That's number one. Number two, notice that there's more space given to his line than there is to any other line. Now, as you look at the line of Ham, you say, well, after all, there's 15 verses here. There's only 11 verses for Shem. But take a look at the number of people mentioned and look at the length of it and the content of it, and the focus is still more on Shem than it is on Ham. Why is Japheth downplayed so much? So little mention of Japheth as compared to Ham and Shem, because the contrast and the conflict is between Ham and Shem. The curse on Ham, the blessing on Shem. This is the pattern of the future history that will be carried on from here. So Japheth is mentioned first, not because he's the oldest, but because he's the least significant. Now that's fascinating, because we would say most of us, being from European stock, are related more closely to Japheth than to Shem or to Ham, especially here in America. And one of the great questions is, why isn't America mentioned in the Bible? Why aren't we there in prophecy or anything? It's not significant. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Those who are insignificant want to be important and significant, and out of hubris and arrogance, we make ourselves more important than we really are in the eyes of God. I mean, just look what God said in Deuteronomy about Israel. I didn't choose you because you're the greatest of all nations. I chose you because you were the least. So it's far better to be the least and to recognize that and be humbled by it and to allow God to do the work that he would do. So Ham and Shem set up a contrast here. And it's fascinating, is it not? Because what do we find mentioned as early as Genesis chapter 15? Where are the descendants of Abraham going to end up for over 400 years? Egypt. Egypt, Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is the descendant of which son of Noah? Ham. Wow. This is going to be played out in more ways than we realize. Pardon? Philistines are in there too. They're going to play a huge role. The Assyrians, I'll tell you, Babylonians. The conflicts of history and the history of Israel, from the patriarchs on down through the nation Israel, are a conflict between Ham and Shem. And when we come to the New Testament, don't you find it kind of amazing in the book of Acts that we have all three sons of Noah represented in the new converts? Who's the first convert spoken of significance in the book of Acts? Ethiopian eunuch in chapter 8. Descendant of what son of Noah? Ham. What's the second convert of significance? After Acts chapter 8 comes Acts chapter 9. Saul. Descendant of which son? Shem. Ham mentioned first. Shem second. Japheth last. Chapter 10 is whom? Cornelius, the Roman centurion. We have all three sons of Noah represented in the book of Acts in 8, 9, and 10, setting the stage for the gospel program. And the first two are Ham and Shem. The same focus, the same type of emphasis. If we don't catch that, if we don't understand that, we can't understand history. And please mark my words here. Some look at this and try to make it a history between black-skinned people and white-skinned people. That's not the case here. Japheth is the white-skinned people. Ham is not just black-skinned people. There are black, there are yellow, there are olive-skinned, there are brown, there are white in Ham, as well as in Shem. Ham and Shem comprise all the peoples that are on the planet. Japheth represents the least number of variety of peoples on the planet and is the least significant. Ham and Shem comprise in their own representation all peoples. That ought to tell us something. It ought to tell us something about God's plan and the way that he's designed it. Remember, he's the one who's sovereign in control of history. He's sovereign in control of fulfilling and working out his program of kingdom and redemption. And so we're going to see this played out over and over and over again. I think it's important for us, even as we read the Gospels, to think about this interplay between Ham and Shem, especially in the Gospel of Matthew. And if we miss it, we're missing part of the storyline. We're missing part of what is called the meta-narrative of Scripture. Theologically, historically, sociologically, redemptively, eschatologically. And when the end comes, what is the great conflict in Revelation 17 through 19? It's a conflict between Babylon and Jerusalem. A conflict between Ham and Shem as the chief representatives. No mention of Japheth in the end time. Think about that. That is astonishing. And yet, what's Cooper demonstrated? That even with the least of the three lines, there is abundant historical evidence demonstrating the historicity of the Genesis account and the genealogy linked to Japheth throughout the peoples of Europe. This is the least of the studies. This is the one that has the least meaning and significance. Where are the studies of the other two great lines and their impact on world history?